There are two main types of cosplay in the motorcycle world. You've got your Power Rangers, typically riding sport bikes, and you've got your pirates, usually riding Harleys. There's also astronauts, which can be found aboard dad bikes. Oh, and Peaky Blinders, who ride Triumphs and Royal Enfields, but that's another story. Sport bike riders pick certain gear and clothes, yes, in part for safety, but also because they want to look like those who race, minus the Oompa Loompa suits. The pirates, though, are trying to look like a very different kind of rider, a rarer breed. I mean, have you seen a large group of very intense-looking, weathered pirate riders and wondered to yourself if they're actually the real deal, you know? The 1%ers, the outlaws. Maybe a tinge of fear creeps in as they slowly cruise by on their loud machines. And then you realize most of these Harleys cost $40,000 or more, and you hear Shania Twain blaring from one of the sound systems, and you're brought back to reality. It's okay, you're not in any danger. These are just retirees with nothing better to do with their money. But are those riders still out there? That subculture of motorcycle gangs and clubs who truly base their entire life around being on two wheels and living on the open road, and sometimes even dabbling in organized crime. Let's take a look back at one of the craziest aspects of motorcycle history, that of the outlaw motorcycle clubs. If you guys are looking to add something fun to your bookshelf, or even better, if you have a child or grandchild or niece or nephew with whom you hope to share your love of motorcycles, check out my children's book Wolf and His Motorbike. If you're curious about it, you can read through reviews both on Goodreads and Amazon. It's a fun little story meant to capture the joy of riding a motorcycle. I've put a ton of work into this and, seems like people really like it. And I haven't stuffed any politics in it like so many other kids' books. No, Wolf's motorcycle isn't electric. Check it out. I think you guys would really like it. And yeah, it's a great way to support the channel. Use the link in the description to check it out. And yeah, let's jump back into the video. Ever since Sylvester Roper took off on a motorcycle in 1896 and literally died of a heart attack from going 40 miles per hour, this two-wheeled experience has enticed and brought together those interested in a different kind of lifestyle. One lived really on the edge. But early on, motorcycling was primarily a gentleman's hobby. Even those motorists who ventured into racing didn't really form countercultural movements. Though motorcycle clubs had existed prior, in many ways it all started post-Great Depression as kind of a cathartic experience. As Bill Hayes says in his amazing book Hell on Wheels, if you can't work, you might as well scrounge up whatever cash you can, hang out with pals at the bar, and drink and ride. This idea of finding freedom on the open road would really take shape after World War II. Riding their Harley WLs overseas was one of the only bits of joy that many of these service members experienced during World War II. So when veterans were given the option to buy surplus military bikes at a fraction of the cost of MSRP, many jumped on the opportunity. Veterans missed the sense of brotherhood and shared purpose that they experienced during the war. Motorcycling and motorcycle clubs offered a way to recapture that camaraderie, and I don't think this is mentioned enough. The structured life of military service really contrasted sharply with civilian life. So motorcycling clubs provided a way for veterans to maintain some of that structure while also rebelling against the conformity of post-war society. I mean, if you think about what it was like during World War II for these service members, and then you think about what America looked like post-war, I mean, these two things were so opposite. Motorcycle clubs have always grown through war. As vets came home from World War II and Korea and even Iraq, membership would expand. And it's not difficult to understand why. It's not just the groups and the brotherhood, it's also that when death and violence becomes the norm for you, going back to the mundane 9 to 5, it's just not easy. And so these groups formed peaceful, brotherly love kind of bonds whose sole purpose was to support their communities, and there was never any fighting. Okay, that's not what happened. Sometimes entire towns manage to become a piece of motorcycle culture in history. Sturgis, of course, comes to mind. Well, in 1947, Hollister, California would go down in history for an event that would prove to be a pivotal moment in shaping the outlaw motorcycle culture. And this is known as the Hollister Riot. This took place during the 4th of July weekend when thousands of motorcyclists descended on the small town for a motorcycle rally organized by the American Motorcyclist Association, or the AMA. The rally brought in massive groups of riders, think like an early Sturgis meetup. And this led to overcrowding and a shortage of accommodations, and over the course of the weekend, some motorcyclists engaged in some rowdy behavior. There was public drinking and racing in the streets and other lewd disturbances. As always, reports of the chaos were highly sensationalized by the media, especially by Life magazine, which published this now famous photograph of a motorcyclist sitting on a Harley Davidson surrounded by empty beer bottles. Now, this image and the exaggerated accounts from this event painted a picture of lawless, rebellious bikers causing mayhem and taking over entire towns. Now, the reality was less dramatic than what was portrayed by the media, but this event really did shape public perception of motorcyclists. It contributed to this idea of the outlaw biker, and it also inspired the 1953 film The Wild One, starring Marlon Brando. If you haven't seen that movie, it depicts a rebellious biker gang, and in many ways, it would cement the image of motorcyclists as these countercultural figures. The Hollister riot is so important because it symbolizes the rather unnecessary tension between motorcyclist subculture and mainstream society, and it laid the groundwork for the iconic status of motorcycles in America as really symbols of rebellion. A very similar event with a similar effect took place years later in Brighton, over in Great Britain, when the mods and the rockers supposedly raised a bunch of hell. Again, in reality, very little happened. Motorcyclists, they're rarely as tough as we portray them. What's important to understand is that motorcycles were proving to be the perfect medium for group formation, and sometimes these groups weren't exactly getting along. Shortly after this event in Hollister, the Hells Angel Club was formed by World War II veterans and motorcycle enthusiasts. If you don't already know, the name Hells Angels more than likely comes from a specific World War II bomber squadron. The initial intention behind the club was to foster a sense of camaraderie and brotherhood, not unlike what these men had in the service, and they shared a passion for motorcycles and for the open road. The general vibe of the Hells Angels Club in its early days was one of rebellion and freedom. Members were drawn to the allure of living outside of societal norms, riding motorcycles, and really embracing a lifestyle that was all about independence and defiance of conventional authority, really above all else. As the 50s carried on, motorcycle clubs would grow from Chicago and the McCook Outlaws to Detroit and the Highwaymen, all the way to Hells Angels and the Jokers in California to the Pagans on the East Coast. Part of what grew this sense of unease about motorcycle gangs was the fact that even in these early days, some members were involved in criminal activity. This isn't surprising. And then when one would commit a crime, no matter how big or small, pictures of them in their MC jackets would go viral, so to speak. Bar fights, alcohol, and then as the 60s got going, other substances, and everything in between, there's no way around a little bit of trouble. The 60s saw motorcycle clubs grow at incredible rates, especially as chopper culture grew. Highly customized bikes could now stand as a symbol of the one percenter's individuality. Being in a motorcycle gang at this point wasn't always necessarily about being countercultural. In many ways, everyone in the 60s was trying to do that. And there were lots of outlets for people to find that kind of spirit and group. And outlaw motorcyclists, for example, with their attire, remained somewhat traditional as the 60s carried on. Now you might say, okay, so most Hells Angels weren't and still aren't necessarily criminals, and that is true, but then where is this stigma about organized crime coming from? Haven't FBI agents infiltrated these one percenter groups and brought down legit criminal enterprises? Well, the relationship between large MCs and the law is complex, to say the least. By the 1980s, many of these outlaw clubs, such as Hells Angels, Bandidos, Outlaws, Mongols, they'd grown significantly. The 80s saw really a consolidation of power within these groups, with many expanding their chapters, not just nationally, but internationally. The Hells Angels, for instance, solidified their presence in Europe and other parts of the world like Australia, placing them right in the forefront of scrutiny by police and the general public. I mean, if you ask 10 people to name a motorcycle club, there's a good chance all 10 will say Hells Angels, and most of them wouldn't even be able to name another group. Certain members of certain groups saw this worldwide growth in numbers, and they decided that they were going to leverage their power for more, shall we say, nefarious, organized activities. I mean, what can you accomplish, and what kind of money can you make when you have organized groups under your control throughout the world? It's difficult for large groups like this, especially ones where the members are entirely committed to the cause. It's difficult for them not to become sort of cults, where the people at the very top abuse their power. And so in the 80s and 90s, we did see large parts of these clubs getting involved into organized crime. This period saw heightened competition between clubs for control over specific types of routes and territories, and this would lead to violent turf wars. Law enforcement agencies responded with vigor, initiating major operations to infiltrate and dismantle these clubs. Operations like Rough Rider targeted the Hells Angels and resulted in quite a few arrests and convictions, in the same way the Bandidos and Outlaws were subjected to intense scrutiny, leading to high-profile cases that exposed the criminal activities of these organizations. I can't get too specific on YouTube because, sometimes YouTube will demonetize you just for mentioning specific things, but it did get bad. At the same time, though, we can't ignore that press was almost always one-sided. Leaders of chapters with no serious criminal involvement would be mysteriously killed while just out on a ride, and the story would be buried, while less, smaller crimes would gain widespread attention. If you want to read a book that is somewhat biased, in a positive way towards MCs, check out that book I mentioned, Hell on Wheels. And yeah, you can get kind of the other side of the story. But then there were infamous events like the Milpera Massacre in 1984, where a clash between the Bandidos and Comancheros in Australia left 7 people dead. And this incident highlighted the brutal rivalries that could erupt within motorcycle clubs. It also led directly to the introduction of Australia's first anti-biker gang laws. The Australian government really saw a need to address organized crime within motorcycle clubs. This event catalyzed the implementation of stricter laws targeting the activities of outlaw motorcycle gangs, including increased surveillance and legislation aimed at curbing gang-related violence and crime. There was also the Laughlin River Run riot in 2002. This was a culmination of tensions that had been brewing for decades. This event led to a deadly brawl between the Hells Angels and the Mongols at a Nevada casino, resulting in multiple fatalities and injuries. During this period, motorcycle clubs also gained increased attention in popular culture. Films, documentaries, and books depicted these groups in a sensationalized manner. Of course, you think of TV shows like Sons of Anarchy, for example. All of this media portrayal really cemented the public's fascination with outlaw biker culture, even as law enforcement sought to crack down on their activities. But even more so than the 80s or 90s, it's really been the past few decades that we've seen some of these motorcycle clubs completely infiltrated and exposed. There was Operation Black Biscuit in the early 2000s. This is one of the most well-known infiltrations targeting the Hells Angels. The ATF ran this operation with undercover agents posing as members of a rival motorcycle club. These agents spent years building trust with the Hells Angels, eventually exposing a slew of crimes. Black Biscuit revealed just how deep the Hells Angels had gone into organized crime, leading to a whole bunch of convictions and significantly disrupting their operations. Imagine working undercover in one of these clubs for years. Then there was Operation Rough Rider. This was a massive multi-agency effort. It resulted in the indictment of 86 members for all sorts of crimes. One of the more controversial aspects of this operation was the federal government's attempt to seize the Mongols' trademarked logo, claiming it was a tool for criminal activity. All of these cases where these clubs were infiltrated have caused the general public to view these groups differently. There is a fear of these groups, and you can understand why. Now, we talk about the rise and fall of motorcycle clubs and of the one percenter and how it seems like these groups are dying, but it's actually not really true. And in my opinion, the statement, the rise and fall of the one percenter, is not so much about membership numbers. These groups are still growing steadily worldwide. To me, it's the actual idea of what an outlaw, rebel, one percenter motorcyclist is meant to be and what it has become. These terms were meant to embody a spirit of going against societal norms, of really living a different kind of life, no different than someone who, for example, sets out to homestead and become self-sufficient. Putting on that jacket and that patch was a way of identifying yourself as part of something very different, and it was something to be proud of, that you were living your life just a bit outside of mainstream norms, and that you weren't afraid of a bit of danger. In fact, you kind of needed that danger. Again, I'm not saying that there aren't people who are a part of these clubs and groups who are trying to live this kind of life. Maybe some of them are even watching this video. But when it becomes about organized crime, that just was not the purpose for military vets originally. Now, before we judge those who do join these groups, I think we can all relate to the intention, at least to some extent, whether it's going against the wishes of our parents and buying that sport bike, or finding motorcycling late into retirement and having the time of your life with that just small bit of danger and adrenaline that you just can't get from bingo or pickleball. You know, the idea of 1%ers came out of that initial Hollister riot back in the 40s, and it was a declaration that yes, 99% of motorcyclists are good law-abiding citizens. It's just that this 1% who are a part of these groups, they're trouble. Now, I don't know how accurate that number is, 1%. I would wager that it's not even that high, maybe 1% of the 1%ers. I do know that roughly 10% of the entire human population owns and rides a motorcycle. So you and I may not be 1%ers, but hey, we can call ourselves 10%ers. I'm sure those in motorcycle clubs would love that. I would love to hear from you guys. Maybe you've spent a few decades in the Hells Angels or another group, and you have a few stories to tell. Let us know your experience in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.